God Speaks, The Theme of Creation and Its Purpose by Meher Baba. Dedication to the universe, the illusion that sustains reality. Preface to the first edition. A number of factors have entered into the writing and editing of this volume, which require some word of explanation. Through the medium of his alphabet board, Meher Baba has dictated in its entirety the present contents of the major portion of this work, consisting of parts 1 through 8. Parts 9 and 10, the 10 States of God, and the conclusion, were written by Erich B. Jesawala in elaboration of notes dictated to him by Meher Baba, and are a recapitulation of the previous sections dictated directly by Meher Baba. Certain footnotes have been added by the editors using both previously published and unpublished statements by Meher Baba, as well as illustrative quotations rendered in free form from the great mystic poets of the East. In addition, several footnotes and the supplement to this work include notes taken down by some disciples of Meher Baba, including the Sufi disciple of more than 25 years standing, the late Dr. Abdul Ghani Munsif, and are based on Baba's explanations and used with his permission. The translation of the Persian poem The Ascending Soul on page 30 is reprinted from Reynold A. Nicholson's Rumi, Poet and Mystic, published by George Allen and Unwin Limited. The quotation from the Bhagavad Gita found on page XX of the introduction is reprinted from Sir Edwin Arnold's The Song Celestial, published by Routledge and Keegan Paul Limited. For permission to reprint these translations, grateful thanks are due to the above publishers. The complete contents of God Speaks have been carefully corrected and approved by Meher Baba. The function of the present editors has been one primarily of handling certain mechanical details necessary in rendering any work into final form for publication. They would hardly have undertaken even this minor function in relation to so fundamental a document had they not been specifically requested to do so by the author. Their own relationship to Sufism reoriented should not be misconstrued by those few persons who are aware of the connection. Meher Baba's pronouncements have always been without sectarian purpose or bias. He has often made direct statements to the effect that he appreciates all isms, Sufism, Vedantism, Christianity, Zoroastrianism, Buddhism, etc., religious and political parties for the many good things that they seek to achieve, but does not and cannot belong to any of them. He regards absolute truth as including and transcending them all, and his function as being detached from all these divine paths, awakening the followers of these divine paths to their real meaning and true spirit. The unity of all life is integral and indivisible. It remains unassailable and inviolable in spite of all ideological differences. That was a quotation. The reader will soon become aware of the fact that numerous passages of God Speaks are distinctly repetitive. If this work were intended to clarify or restate some reasonably well-known theorem of current culture, it would perhaps be desirable to arrange the work in a simple, logical sequence and allow the thesis to unfold in brief finality. However, God Speaks not only picks up the fragments of many previous concepts of spiritual truth and arranges them in orderly and mutually compatible fashion, but it takes the entire subject several steps further than it has historically existed and establishes several new and detailed thought patterns. To do this effectively, it seems necessary to look at the subject matter again and again from a number of angles, and with increasing conceptual proliferation. Illustrations and anecdotes are often repeated in these various circumstances in order that each portion may be self-contained, thus obviating the necessity of the reader's referring back to earlier passages for details which might be omitted in a later context. The net result is not unlike the effect achieved musically in the constantly elaborating theme of a Ravel's bolero or a Bach fugue from the Well-Tempered Clavichord. Although it would seem at first a minor item, one of the most troublesome issues in undertaking the editing of this work has been the establishing of a consistent policy for capitalization of words. The normal procedure of reserving such usage for proper names, the deity and his immediate attributes, is brought to a sorry dilemma in a work which has as its major thesis the divinity of all creation. To establish such a connotation in strict literality would result in a flood of capital letters, which not only would not aid in emphasizing such a thesis, but would obstruct the progress of the reader. This matter is made even more puzzling by the subtle fashion in which Meher Baba gradually draws the consciousness of the reader from the concept of God in his unmanifest states to those stages of development in which the individualized soul is apparently furthest from realizing his essential eternal oneness with God. A strictly rational policy on capitalizations during such a progression of development, ending in a final return to full union with the Father, is apparently unobtainable, and therefore the editors have adopted the more feasible usage of capitalizing the deity and his immediate attributes, and thereafter have used capitals primarily for the sake of emphasis and helping the reader to distinguish readily between conditions associated with the higher as contrasted with the more gross planes, i.e., capital E energy of the subtle planes compared to lowercase nuclear energy. Similar problems were encountered in as mechanical a process as punctuation. In the complex issues which Meher Baba sorts out for meticulous elucidation, strict adherence to classic rules of punctuation would result in an almost unendurable jumble of commas, colons, dashes, and semicolons. Here again, the editors have adopted an arbitrary policy of deliberately avoiding meticulous usage of punctuation within a sentence, as long as the thought flowed readily. In many instances, Meher Baba has coined terms to express a specific concept. It has seemed preferable to ensure exact understanding of his intent, rather than to render the work more conventional by substitution of well-seasoned terminology which almost expresses the content of the coined phrase. Inverted and complex sentence structure has also been left in numberless instances where possible ambiguity or a breaking of the flow of thought seemed to result from re-inversion of structure or shortening of sentences. In brief, the function of editor is to render a work into conventional usage and for ready assimilation. Wherever the present editors have found this inconsistent with the major purpose of the work, Conventional usage and simplicity of style have been happily sacrificed for specificity of intent. It would not do to leave the mechanical phase without cautioning the reader that most writers differentiate between the terms, quote, knowledge and, quote, wisdom, assigning a more valued or spiritual function to the latter. Meher Baba makes no such differentiation and uses knowledge rather in the sense of true knowledge. After intense concentration on this volume, some readers may wish to broaden their knowledge of Meher Baba's viewpoint on the subject of the finite and the infinite. Additional valuable material is contained in his Discourses in 5 volumes, published by Meher Publications Ahmednagar, India, as well as in Meher Baba's foreword to Dr. William Donkin's The Wayfarers, and also chapter 1 of that work. So the Discourses are republished in 1 volume by Shariar Press, 1987, and The Wayfarers was reprinted by Shariar Press, 1988. Washington, D.C., January 23, 1955, signed Ivy O. Deuce and Don E. Stevens. Introduction to the first edition. God has never spoken in my presence, but I am sure that I have seen him act in human form. That is the only manner in which I can explain the incredible sensitivity of action and reaction which characterized Meher Baba during those brief periods on a Sunday afternoon in New York when I first saw him in action. He was telling a story of a seeker after truth who was called upon to bear acts of arbitrariness and harshness of an extreme degree before his teacher would accept him. As Meher Baba's fingers flew over the alphabet board, which he uses for communication, and as his hands raised occasionally in brief gesticulation, I found myself wrapped even more in the teller and manner of telling than in the story. Sitting off to the side and outside his line of vision, I raised my hand almost involuntarily, with thumb to forefinger, to inscribe the age-old circle of perfection. Even as I started to do so, I was warmed to see Meher Baba turn his gaze full upon me and lift his own hand in the identical gesture. Human beings are not too often aware of the feelings of their fellows, let alone minutely responsive to them, and it surprised me to be in the presence of someone who possessed such sensitivity of feeling. I forgot the episode until he was en route to the elevator late in the day, and as I stood among a knot of people at the side of his passageway, I again raised my hand in a similar gesture, now deliberately wondering if he would catch it in the even less probable position in which I was placed. Again, as I started the gesture, he turned until he looked me full in the face and repeated his response. This time I was even more surprised than delighted at what now began to assume the proportions of an unexplainable phenomenon. As he progressed on out into the hall and finally proceeded through the door of the elevator, I raised my hand quickly a third time to make the gesture of the circle of perfection. This time he turned his entire body and with deliberation repeated his acknowledgement. I do not feel that this is a trivial incident to introduce as important a topic as the basic purpose and mechanics of creation, and the author of that treatise. Meher Baba is memorable and eminently satisfying, not because of his undoubted genius in the realm of philosophy and universal mechanics, but because he has the capacity to warm the cockles of one's heart as perhaps no other living being is able to do. In the long run, each one of us is searching for a deep inner sense of satisfaction and peace, a feeling of being contained in some presence which is trustworthy and loving, for a spontaneous understanding and response to our innermost needs. Above all, we need to be ourselves and to be accepted completely for ourselves. The deep response which Meher Baba elicits from so many people is due to that undreamed of sensitivity to one's most profound self. There are many things of a much more astounding nature which I might recount from the vast lore which has accumulated around this figure in the 4 decades since he achieved his present spiritual stature. But all of them would obscure the one central issue, his complete ability not only to understand, but in some manner to be one's own self. Don't ask me to describe such a phenomenon, nor to explain it. It must be experienced to be believed. Even so, one would expect such a feeling of well-being to fade gradually after its source has been removed. Even the most ecstatic experience normally fades and becomes a memory, as does a nightmare as well. However, therein lies another of the unexplainable mysteries of contact with such a being. As I sat in the plane en route home after a jammed, eventful weekend, I started to resort back into my usual context of reality. Turning over one or two of my pet worries in my mind, I realized suddenly that they no longer worried me. Not being easily panicked into rash conclusions, I sampled several more troubles and was completely puzzled to find that in some instances I could see answers where I had seen none before, and in others I could recapture no sense of agitation. Frankly, I thoroughly expected to renew my usual troubled relation with these difficult subjects as soon as I settled down at home again. But as the days and weeks and months and finally years rolled by, I began to realize that even a short weekend in the company of such a man had performed a major surgery on my emotional anatomy and had removed my ability to worry. I describe these incidents in no sense of pride nor of beating a tom-tom. They are 2 events which occurred in my own life, and I would be remiss to omit them from the small frame which I have been entrusted to construct around the masterly painting created in the following pages. I am sure that I have not knowingly heard God speak, but I am sure that in my lifetime I have seen him act. In the choice of a title for his book, God Speaks, Meher Baba has succinctly stated both the major thesis which he is to elaborate, as well as his right to speak authoritatively on subjects which may be treated by only the most advanced of our era. Before discussing the right of the author to imply such a sublime source for his work, it might be well to complete the complexity of the issue by stating quite simply that the greatest proportion of Meher Baba's disciples and followers from all over the world regard him as the avatar of the age. Put in Western terminology, they consider him as the Christ of our times, the successor to the tradition of Muhammad, Jesus, Buddha, Krishna, Rama, Zoroaster, and so on back into the dusky past, and as the identical nature which reincarnated in those specific and successive personalities. If Meher Baba occupies such a crowning position in the spiritual structure of our civilization, then there would be no question of his right to speak positively and with authority on the deepest mechanics of creation. But the simpler issue of his divine source then becomes the much greater one of the legitimacy of his function in the key role of a religious hierarchy, which in turn is doubted or frankly disbelieved by many people. In 2 paragraphs, we have stated a tremendous and challenging problem, but it is one which must be worked out in actuality by means other than the written words of an introduction. In the long run, there are only 2 reliable answers to the fundamental question of whether a given man is the Messiah. The personal answer can be personal contact. At this writing, this is still physically possible, and many have already availed themselves of this direct attack on the issue. Many have concluded their question in the affirmative. A surprisingly small proportion have reached a definite negative, and another portion have confessed a deep bemusement in which pleasure and delight are 2 major ingredients, but still with an apparent inability to reach an ultimate conclusion on the ultimate question. The broad and long-term answer must be the net assessment which society makes over the generations to come of the forces set in motion. If the words spoken and the concepts advanced seem to grow in vitality and reality, then the man is automatically recognized by hindsight to have been the great sculptor of the divine shape for his age. But no amount of advance argument nor demonstration can convince society. It is as if the concepts carry their own vitality and become the property and the watchword of the race, regardless of the efforts to conjoin or defeat their purpose. For many, however, there will be no opportunity for personal contact, nor for acceptance or rejection in the flesh. And as these events are occurring in our age, none of us can rely on the consensus of evaluation that society will have made over the generations that are to come. For these, then, who are in such a position, it is required to peruse and to think and to mull with an open mind. For here may well be a great storehouse of the truth and reality for which each of us searches throughout a lifetime. It is not necessary to make a crisis of acceptance or rejection, but to allow the concepts described to simmer in one's own mental stew pot. Gradually, one's own deep sense of the sufficient, as well as the sheer factuality of life itself, will corroborate or refute the outlines described. The outlines described. The outlines described will corroborate or refute the outlines described. The outlines described will corroborate or refute the outlines described. The outlines described will corroborate or refute the outlines described. The outlines described will corroborate or refute the outlines described. The outlines described will corroborate or refute the outlines described. The outlines described will corroborate or refute the outlines described. The outlines described will corroborate or refute the outlines described. The outlines described will corroborate or refute the outlines described. The outlines described will corroborate or refute the outlines described. The outlines described will corroborate or refute the outlines described. The outlines described will corroborate or refute the outlines described. The outlines described will corroborate or refute the outlines described. The outlines described will corroborate or refute the outlines described. The outlines described will corroborate or refute the outlines described. The outlines described will During the 5 years which elapsed between the time I first became aware of the fact that there was someone in existence named Meher Baba and my meeting him for the first time in New York, I had ample opportunity to question and rebel and come back to the neutral point of, quote, I just don't know, end quote, on any number of the controversial issues of Meher Baba's life. He is not an easy man either to accept or to reject. That one weekend, with its several opportunities to see him in action, was sufficient to convince me that he was hands down the best storyteller with gentle humor, even via the handicap of an alphabet board, I had ever encountered. The best business mind I had known in a life spent working in big business, the best philosopher I had met, and the most sensitively human and loving individual I had ever enjoyed. These are certainly a sufficiently formidable collection of qualities, but you immediately object that the addition of finite quantities can never produce infinity. Had I decided that he was really the avatar of the age? Frankly, I haven't the foggiest notion, and to me the question is irrelevant. I'm sure I would have no means of judging the qualifications and achievements of avatarhood, and further, I had found Meher Baba surpassing all of my previous standards of excellence in areas in which I felt competent to judge. Once the rocket has left my terrestrial sphere, I have no concrete means of identifying its position in stellar space. But this I can say, my own intuition tells me that I shall never again meet an individual with those profound capabilities, and that uncanny ability to satisfy me internally, which I found in Meher Baba. I cannot help but think back to a statement which one of my research fellows made some years ago after hearing a brilliant discussion of the real Christ given by a director of the Mormon Church. Quote, I have an idea, he said, that if Christ were on earth today, almost none of us would recognize or accept him. Those words have peculiar meaning to me now because they have a content much deeper than the apparent cynicism shown on their surface. Almost none of us would recognize him, not only because of our ingrained prejudices, but because almost none of us has developed the inner standards of measurement capable of estimating the true size of such a being. His capacity and stature soar off into realms where we are incapable of following, and so we admit our frustration in sizing, even if we have not already succumbed to the virtually insuperable temptation to reject. One of our most frequent crutches in estimating the probable spiritual caliber of a man is to look for miracles accredited to him. What miracles has Meher Baba done to corroborate his stature, you ask? There are many stories of such, and I have personally witnessed events which startled my staid notions of the normalcy of events. However, to start evaluating miracles would fall far short of the actuality and would becloud the reality with trivia. The importance of the advent of a spiritually advanced soul lies not in what he apparently does outside of natural law, but what he is and does within it. Such an individual does not come as some sort of glorified showman to astound by performing feats of incredibility, This would only leave humanity gaping for a short while in amazement, rather than affecting the basic pattern of their lives and giving them a gauge by which they might measure their own accomplishments, as well as reaffirming the ability of any human to achieve such a way of life. These key figures in the history of the spiritual life take on a superhuman job of providing a living example of perfection, demonstrated amid all the restrictions and limitations with which we more usual human beings are faced. To provide such an example by drawing on forces outside our scope or unhampered by many of the restrictions with which we wrestle would clearly not be just, and we would have every right to dissociate ourselves from such an unrealistic scheme. When the example is provided, however, in a rugged world of harsh realities, subject to all the conditions of those realities, and still turns out incredibly fine, then there is indeed reason to take hope and strive for the same thing. This is one of the functions of such individuals. One of the best established principles of effective teaching is to provide a practical demonstration of the subject matter, either through a bench experiment or by field experience. The fact that God Himself should use the identical technique in the demonstration of His realities should astound no one. These are tremendous things which we encounter, and we must not be hasty in our assessment of them. One might ask at this point the circumstances under which a God-man manifests. This seems to follow a basic natural law of need, similar to the economic law of supply and demand. When the thread of recognition of spiritual truth begins to fray, this aspect of God responds to the need, and the great awakener is born who will reawaken mankind. As a consequence, the advent of great spiritual teachers has always been associated with crisis in world affairs and has been followed by a resurgence of human development in some field which previously had lain almost fallow. It is good to know that when the Avatar comes, he comes to show us the reality of our own selves through laws and techniques which are inherent in nature. It is good to know that these things are hardy, spontaneous, and at least three-dimensional, rather than removed, otherworldly, pale, and two-dimensional. It is good to know that when a legitimate spiritual teacher assigns a task or a discipline, it is effective because it is based on profound insight into the mechanics by which nature produces change and the needs of the individual nature. Spirituality then becomes a challenging matter of robust day-to-day living rather than a restrictive discipline acquired on Sundays and progressively lost through the week. It would not be fair to touch on various of the highlights of the history of Meher Baba without discussing several controversial aspects of his nature. For instance, he often changes his plans in midstream, or says he intends to do something at a certain time, and then delays or seemingly never does it. Isn't this irresponsible and short-sighted coming from so great a personage? Meher Baba's process of sudden reversal is indeed rugged, but it does produce valuable results. Those who have lived long with Baba are almost universally notable for their resiliency and adaptability. But in addition to this, there are undoubtedly more basic reasons which have to do with the sheer indeterminacy of the average human being's free will, as well as the functioning of a perfect master on levels of existence other than our own. I cannot help but speculate that there is a direct carryover from the lessons learned in the world of material affairs into the realm of spiritual development. Isn't it true that the individual who has never ossified into a set physical routine, but is rather alert and adaptable, will have a similar adaptability to the multitudinous changes to be made in inner development? The fact that Meher Baba fasts quite frequently is incomprehensible to many people unacquainted with his way of working. Baba has always fasted intermittently for short and long periods, and this phase appears consistently and importantly in his work. This has sometimes been misconstrued as a good and holy act for himself, or for penance or spiritual benefit, but it is not for himself, but rather for his work on earth. As Krishna said to Arjuna in the Bhagavad Gita, "Thou son of Pritha, in the three wide worlds I am not bound to any toil. No height awaits to scale, no gift remains to gain, yet I act here." Canto 3-22. Meher Baba's silence of almost 3 decades and substitution of an alphabet board as a means of communication are equally puzzling. Many people may regard it as unproductive to use an alphabet board, and some even label it a subterfuge. There have been a number of discussions by Meher Baba and others on the reasons for this prolonged silence. I do not wish to go into the various potential explanations here, but rather to call attention to the most astounding fact of all. Despite such a severe handicap, the equivalent of having one hand tied behind one's back, Meher Baba has planned minutely and personally the most complex undertakings, taught hundreds and blessed thousands, directed undertakings, and given words of cheer to persons at far distant points, and, quote, dictated in a relatively brief period of time as monumental an enterprise as this book. Meher Baba's methods are often productive of exasperation. There are many things which he does which defy understanding, and he blithely goes on about his business without bothering to proffer an explanation. For myself, I admire greatly someone who does not sit down at every step to justify himself, but there are apparently quite sound reasons for such behavior, in that there just is not time for constant explanation, nor is there probably in us the comprehension to encompass an explanation of the more abstruse phases, if given. On February 25, 1894, Meher Baba was born of Persian parents in Pune, India, and was given by them the name Merwan Shahryar, the family name being Irani. In 1914, he became God-realized. Asterisk. The avatar is in reality one with God, but comes into the physical world with a veil which must be removed by a perfect master when the time is right. Hazrat Babajan performed this function for Baba. In 1914, he became God realized through a kiss on the forehead bestowed by the great Sufi master Hazrat Babajan. In 1915, he met his second master, Upasni Maharaj. In 1921, he became a perfect master. In 1925, he commenced his silence, using as a means of communication a small rectangular board on which are painted the letters of the alphabet. Baba forms words quickly by pointing successively to the letters on this board. By this time he had collected a small group of disciples who called him Meher Baba. In 1931, he went to the Western world and made his first contacts with the West. In 1932, he was feted by many of those whom you and I would perhaps consider Hollywood's greatest. At 58, he broke a leg and an arm in a severe automobile accident in Oklahoma. Now, at the age of 61, Meher Baba is dynamic, active, acutely aware of all that goes on about him. I have not tried to give in any detail the events of Baba's earlier life because they have been ably described in C.B. Purdam's The Perfect Master. Followed more recently by Jean Adriel's Avatar. The biographical outline given here is intended as nothing more than a point of orientation, so that we may go on to discuss several of the key issues associated with Baba's life, which are inherently complex and perhaps impossible of interpretation in the long run. There has been much speculation concerning the reason for many of Baba's actions and journeys, but the greater proportion continue to be shrouded in some degree of mystery. In such a situation, the usual procedure is to declare the individual irrational and to write off his actions as delusion. This is not done with Baba for the simple reason that a goodly number of his efforts and suggestions are seen to be based on an insight into the shape of things utterly beyond the average human ken. Often such an outcome results within hours. Sometimes the verdict of events is not given for weeks or months or even years. However, this uncanny insight causes those who have invested more than a few moments of casual criticism to hold their peace and be prepared to find the desirable long-term answer back of any of Baba's actions, regardless of how imponderable they may appear at the time. There is further reason to regard Baba's deeds and suggestions with credence. One would be hard put to find one single situation in which his influence has resulted in harm to the individual concerned. He will often push a person to the point of exhaustion or even desperation in order to increase the capacity of that individual. But there is a fine line of the possible which he never transgresses. One of the periods in Baba's life which has both drama and pathos in it, beautifully described by Ramju Abdullah in Sobs and Throbs, included in Ramju's diaries, 1922 to 1929, editor Ira G. Dietrich, Walnut Creek, California, Sufism Reoriented, 1979. So I'll reread. One of the periods in Baba's life which has both drama and pathos in it is that covering the establishment of his school for boys of all sects and castes. Established in the summer of 1927, it contained at one point a total of 102 boys, of whom 49 were Hindus, 20 Muslims, 32 Zoroastrians, and 1 Christian. One of Baba's favorites among the students, Ali, was removed from the school by his father when he became alarmed by reports that many of the boys in the school had periodic fits of uncontrolled weeping. These were apparently related in some fashion to the daily meditations which the boys carried out. 3 times, Ali's father removed the boy from the school and carried him off to his home in Bombay. 3 times the boy escaped from the most careful surveillance and made his way back, mostly on foot, to the school. So deep was his loyalty to Baba. Shortly after the occasion of Ali's 4th withdrawal, the schoolboys were all sent home temporarily by Meher Baba, and early in 1929, the school was permanently closed. Soon after this, Baba's period of extended world tours began, and in 7 short years he made 7 trips to the West and 2 around the world. Attendant on these was some favorable publicity, and much that was critical or even scurrilous. Baba has never attempted to develop a favorable, quote, press. He persistently maintains that those who attack him do his work equally with those who praise him. His consistency in his attitude of refusing to defend himself or to correct errors in quoting his, quote, remarks, or even simple misunderstandings, is a phenomenon in this day when the world has become convinced of the need for vindication of oneself in the eyes of society. Such absolute indifference might well be attributed to failure to realize practicality, but one ends up with the sense that Baba acts according to deep internal knowledge and is satisfied that the results will occur regardless of interpretation. Great receptions were held for him in Europe and in America, and the publicity which rocketed back and forth on his introduction to Hollywood created a flood of statements which will never be completely integrated. These trips to the West produced their own treasury of incidents rich in human emotion. One that has always interested me deeply has been the account of Baba's meeting with a Russian lady who was profoundly disturbed because of her inability to form any sense of warm relatedness to her daughter, who at that time was in her 20s. Baba stroked her hand and told her that he would help her, and several days later, when she awakened in the morning, she was suffused by a deep and warm sense of love for the daughter, such as she had never known. She asked forgiveness at once of her daughter for her treatment of her in the past, and forthwith there was established a profound and trusting relationship. Another instance which savors of the magic lamp of human emotions was Baba's meeting in Italy with a disturbed and brilliant university professor who unpacked his own knowledge of esoteric philosophy before Baba. After arriving at complete frustration in his efforts to piece together the components of his life's wisdom, in spite of Baba's patience in listening, he finally threw up his hands in despair and asked Baba just to sit quietly with him in meditation. Baba smiled and laid his hand over that of the professor, and those present in the room comment on the rapt sense of peace which suffused the room and gradually erased the appearance of desperation from the face of the man. After a few moments of silence, he suddenly exclaimed, "I know now that truth is love." There are miraculous tales of Baba's stay in the cave in which St. Francis of Assisi had once meditated, of a meeting of the hierarchy atop a mountain in the Swiss Alps, and of the violent storm which raged as Baba stood untouched in a shaft of light which pierced the disgorging clouds, while those who attended him were drenched as they stood waiting for him a few feet down the slope. There followed some years spent in dealing with the mad and then the spiritually intoxicated. A so-called mad ashram was established at Rahuri in 1936, to which Baba and his disciples brought a number of truly mad individuals. Later, Baba's work was increasingly with the spiritually intoxicated, those who had lost their normal conscious contact with their surroundings as a result of the intoxication of their divine love. The difference between conventional madness and loss of normal consciousness as a result of spiritual ecstasy is recognized in India, and as a tradition, the people care for these latter, quote, musts, as they are termed. Baba's work in this field is reminiscent of the function performed for him over the course of 7 years by Upasni Maharaj, the perfect master, who gradually brought him back to full consciousness of his surroundings after the kiss on his forehead by the Sufi master Babajan had torn away the veil. Both of these perfect masters selected Meher Baba as their spiritual chargeman, parentheses, spiritual heir, a unique function uniting the highest flowering of both Hindu and Islamic traditions. Meher Baba's work with the masts in his ashram at Rahuri branched out increasingly, and over the course of the ensuing years, he made more and more trips into the heart and to the far corners of India, contacting, even if for a brief instant, all the available musts and saints. The story of these journeys is replete with instances of severe hardship and the expenditure of great effort on the part of all who participated. For details, see William Donkin, The Wayfarers. Once again, one can only speculate on the inference of such contacts. If I were to hazard a guess, I would suppose that a dual function had been fulfilled. Such spiritually advanced souls certainly control or have available some type of basic psychic or cosmic energy, term it what one may. As a whole, they act something like the worker bee, and India functions somewhat as the honeycomb. Baba, as the royal patriarch of the hive, was setting up his liaison to draw upon this vast store of energy, and in return, no doubt, gave each individual must or saint a further push in his spiritual ongoing. This contacting of the musts reached a climax in the period of 1946 to 1948, and was followed by 2 years of what Baba has called his, quote, new life phase, starting on October 16, 1949. This is doubtless the most imponderable of all the imponderables with which the student has to deal. Preceding the new life, Baba broke up all the ashrams maintained for the musts and for the more or less permanent close disciples, as well as for the constant flow of people whose stays range all the way from a brief interview to a period of weeks, months, or years. Provision was made for the care of those who were dependent, and then Baba asked for volunteers to follow him on a series of journeys, often on foot, and involving the most severe hardships. Rigid rules of discipline and renunciation were set up before the disciples were asked for volunteers to follow Baba into this new phase of his new life, which was one of exile, helplessness, and renunciation. 20 were finally selected and set out with Baba. The travels and spiritual disciplines of those 2 years were among the most difficult which Baba's disciples have ever undergone. Those who participated in the journeys were tired, thin, and drawn as they emerged in late 1951. The detailing of the events and their significance must await a more extensive work, but the onlooker cannot help but conclude that in this obscure phase there was established a major blueprint for the future individual and social development of the race. On October 16, 1950, Baba had stated at Mahabaleshwar, quote, "My old life places me on the altar of godhood and divine perfection. My new life makes me take the stand of an humble servant of God and his people. In my new life, I am the seeker, the lover, and the friend. Both these aspects, perfect divinity and perfect humility, have been God's will, and both are everlastingly linked with God's eternal life." End quote. On February 13th, 1951, Baba had gone into seclusion at Mahabaleshwar for about 100 days, at the end of which he stated that on October 16 it would be necessary for him to enter another phase of his work. This latter came to be known as Manonash, parentheses, annihilation of the mind. I'll just repeat that. This latter came to be known as the Manonash, annihilation of the mind, period. This work lasted 4 months, ending February 16, 1952. Baba then announced that he and a few disciples would leave shortly for the United States and that he would lead from March 21st to July 10th, 1952, a, quote, complicated, free, end quote, life in which weakness would predominate over strength. From July 10 to November 15, a, quote, full free, end quote, life in which strength would predominate over weakness. And from November 15 on a, quote, fiery, free, end quote, life in which both strength and weakness would be consumed in the fire of divinity. On April 20th, 1952, Baba arrived in New York with 6 men and 6 women, disciples of both Eastern and Western origins. They went directly to Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, where a property had been dedicated to Baba, and after a period of several weeks, Baba received many old and new followers, particularly on May 17, when a vast crowd congregated from all over the United States to see him.